Hello. Tonight we will embark on a journey back to the mid-17th century, a place where legendary figures have left their mark on history, so that you can lie still and listen to the wind drifting through ancient memories. Imagine you are lying by a flickering fireplace in an old stone house in the English countryside. Outside, the wind howls through the oak trees, the candlelight flickers, and a story is about to unfold that will leave you both curious and sleepy. To be honest, if you were thrown back to that time, you probably wouldn't survive. Because there was no Wi-Fi, no Starbucks coffee, and no Netflix button for you to scroll back and forth whenever you felt bored. Before you lie down comfortably, remember to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly find what I do here lovely and valuable. And you should also try to comment on where you are listening to this story and what time it is now. Now, turn down the lights. Turn on your box fan or Marpac dome for some gentle background noise, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. You are heading to the southwest of the land of mist, the Somerset region, full of lush green fields, where in 1632, a baby boy let out his first cry. That child was born into a devout, humble Puritan family and grew up early amidst the tense atmosphere of civil wars, where ancient church roofs cast their shadows upon the peaceful river of Wrington village. You opened your eyes to greet the world on a late summer afternoon, the 29th of August, 1632, in a small village named Wrington, nestled in the shadows of the lush green hills of Somerset. The world welcomed you with the scent of dry grass and the dampness of the lingering rains characteristic of the English countryside. In that moment, your mind was like an absolute blank slate tabula rasa, without a single ink mark of experience, nor an imprint of pain or knowledge. You were a pure beginning, an entity waiting for the first vibrations of the outside world to touch your senses and begin shaping a human being. On that same day, you were taken to the local church for baptism. The bells of Wrington Church rang out, blending into the quiet space of the countryside, marking the presence of a new life in the devout Puritan community. You lay there, small and fragile, in the arms of Agnes Keene, a mother carrying the blood of skilled tanners. From your mother, you received not only gentle care, but also inherited an atmosphere of solemn faith, where individual conscience was placed above all, and every action was reflected in the light of the Bible. Shortly after your birth cries subsided, and your family moved to Pensford, a village not far from Bristol, this was where your first memories began to be etched. Your home was not grand. It carried the modest look of a middle class striving to position itself in society. Your father, also named John Locke, was a country lawyer, a diligent clerk to the local justices. He was the embodiment of discipline and severity. In your early years, you looked at your father as a distant figure, a man of dry legal documents and unshakable moral rules. He did not embrace you with sweet words, but trained you with a commanding silence. Yet, within that silence, you began to learn the first lesson of order, that this world operates based on laws, and to survive, one must clearly understand Tone's position. You were not a healthy child. Illness visited frequently, and your lungs seemed too weak to inhale the damp air of Somerset. While other children ran across the fields, you often had to sit by the window, watching the world through misted glass panes. Physical fragility inadvertently pushed you into a profound inner world. You became an observer. You observed raindrops rolling down the glass, watched how your father turned each page of his files, and watched how your mother prayed silently. You learned that when the body cannot reach far, the mind is the place to explore new horizons. When you were 10, in 1642, the peaceful sky of your childhood was abruptly torn apart. Rumors of the rift between King Charles I and Parliament began to creep into every family meal. The world that was once tranquil suddenly became unstable. The English Civil War erupted like a firestorm, and Somerset, your homeland, turned into a fiercely contested territory. You heard the pounding of horse hooves on village roads, the clashing of metal, and the anxious whispers of adults. Your father, the quiet lawyer, now shed his black robe to don the uniform of a cavalry captain in the parliamentary army. The image of the already strict father now became even more fearsome and majestic, with a sword at his side. He left the family to fight for an ideal, against the arbitrary power of the monarch, to protect the freedom of conscience. This was the first great paradox to touch your soul. The father you always feared for his absolute discipline was now taking up arms to demand freedom. You began to wonder, what is freedom that makes men willing to leave their hearths to face death? Could it be that freedom is not chaos, but a higher order built on consent and reason? During this period, fear became an uninvited companion. You learned that words could kill. A mistaken declaration of loyalty, an ill-timed expression of faith, could lead to the confiscation of estates or even the gallows. In that context, prudence was not just a virtue, it was a survival tool. You saw division tear apart old friendships, saw neighbors look at each other with suspicious eyes. Your silence during these years was no longer the silence of a shy child, but the silence of a strategist learning to protect his most precious thoughts from the scrutiny of the outside world. Amidst the violent upheavals of war, your education was tenaciously maintained by your father's hand. On those rare occasions when he returned home from the battlefield, your father would sit down with you by the flickering candlelight. Instead of fairy tales, he taught you Latin, made you study the Bible, and practice the austere moral lessons of the Puritans. You learned to read, not for entertainment, but to seek the truth hidden between the lines. Every Latin word you learned was a brick, building a fortress of knowledge, where you could take refuge when the outside world was too uncertain. The Puritan family environment emphasized that every individual has a direct connection to God without going through any mediating power. This sowed within you the seeds of resistance to arbitrary power. You understood that, even in his utmost severity, your father still respected your capacity for independent thought. The relationship between you and your father gradually changed. Initial fear gave way to a deep respect and a discreet friendship. He was no longer a phantom of power, but a teacher who taught you that a person's most precious assets are reason and internal freedom. Your life might have stayed forever in the Somerset fields, if not for a fateful turning point. During the years of fighting, your father served under Colonel Alexander Popham, an influential man and a local MP. Your father's loyalty and competence made a strong impression on Popham. It was this colonel who saw the potential hidden behind your frail appearance and sharp, observant eyes. Patronage, a concept you would later analyze extensively in your social theories, opened the door that led you away from the grip of the war-torn countryside. At the end of this period, when you were about 14, a golden opportunity appeared. You were nominated to study at Westminster School in London, one of the most prestigious schools in England at the time. It was a grand transformation. You were preparing to leave the atmosphere smelling of tanned leather of the Keene family, leaving the Somerset Hills where the sound of cannons still echoed in your sleep, to head toward the center of power and knowledge. What did you carry in your luggage to London? You carried the fear of instability, the prudence of a survivor, and a mind that had begun to doubt rigid dogmas. But more importantly, you carried a fierce belief that the human mind is a work still under construction. You were no longer a completely blank slate. The first lines of ink had been written with the blood of the Civil War, with the tears of a devout mother, and with the severity of a captain father. The early modern world was taking shape, and you, John Locke, were standing at its threshold. You did not yet know that your quiet thoughts would later overthrow kings, but at this moment, you were just a scrawny teenager, learning to breathe amidst the dust of war and the flickering light of reason. You understood that to change the world, you must first learn to observe it without being crushed by it. Silence is the sanctuary of the mind, and within that sanctuary, you were silently sketching the first blueprints for an era of freedom. The first steps away from Somerset were hesitant ones. You looked back at the house in Pensford, where your father stood, still solemn, but his eyes containing a secret hope. You realized that even if the world collapsed or empires changed, real power lay not in your father's sword, but in the ability to understand the laws of nature and society taking shape in your head. You traveled toward London, carrying scars from the memory of a country tearing itself apart. Those scars did not make you weak. They became landmarks for you to locate the truth. You wondered, how can humans live together without resorting to violence? How can a society be built on freedom instead of coercion? These questions began to sprout in your mind like seeds waiting for spring. You were preparing to enter a larger world, where your words would no longer be whispers in the dark, but would become wake-up calls for all of humanity. The journey from Wrington to Westminster was not just a trip long in geographical distance, but the first migration of a soul seeking light amidst the darkness of fanaticism. You knew the road ahead would be fraught with traps, where keeping one's identity and thoughts hidden was sometimes more important than expressing them. But now, as the carriage rolled away from your beloved Somerset, you were simply a 14-year-old boy, leaning your head against the side of the carriage, listening to the steady rhythm of your own heart, and beginning to write the next chapters onto the blank slate of your life. Each rotation of the wheels was a departure from the past, but also a reinforcement of what you had learned. You carried your mother's piety as a moral compass, and your father's prudence as a protective shield. You entered London, just as the city itself was shuddering and transforming into the heartbeat of history. There, your ideas would be forged in the furnace of the fiercest debates, so that one day, you would become the architect in the shadows, the one who drafted the foundations for the modern world we live in. But that is a story for the future. For now, let the warmth of Somerset memories keep you warm in the morning chill on the road to London. Let silence envelop you, because within that very silence, the power of reason is quietly growing, waiting for the moment to explode and change the course of history forever. The carriage rattled you into the heart of London, into air thick with coal smoke and dampness from the Thames. You were then only a 14-year-old boy, your eyes never ceasing to marvel at the scale and clamor of a capital city in the throes of a historical fever. Somerset had now receded, giving way to narrow streets, echoing street cries, and the silhouettes of gray, majestic stone buildings. You stepped off the carriage, carrying a new identity, laden with responsibility, a student of Westminster School. Your presence here was not an accident, nor was it because your family belonged to the illustrious aristocracy. You stood in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, thanks to a favor, a calculated and powerful act of patronage. Alexander Popham, the colonel your father had devotedly served in the parliamentary cavalry, used his influence as an MP to swing these gates open for you. You realized very early on that in this world, a person's status is sometimes determined not only by talent, but by invisible threads connecting those who hold power. You were a stranger among the elite's children, a Puritan outsider entering the cathedral of elite education. Westminster School was more than just a school. It was a rigorous furnace for the mind. Every morning before the dawn could pierce London's thick fog, you had to wake up to the cold 5 a.m. alarm. In towering stone rooms, where the cold seeped into your very marrow, you began the journey of conquering ancient languages. Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and even Arabic. These languages were not merely tools for communication. They were keys to the storehouses of human thought. You labored over manuscript pages, strange letters dancing under the flickering candlelight. You learned that to understand the nature of the world, you must trace the roots of words. Running this school was a figure of great authority and contradiction. Headmaster Richard Busby. He was an extreme royalist, famous for a severity bordering on cruelty and a birch rod always ready to punish any negligence. This was an ironic paradox surrounding your teenage years. You, the son of a parliamentary officer who fought against the king, were now being molded by a man who worshipped absolute monarchy, right in the heart of parliamentary-controlled London. Under Busby's hand, you learned absolute silence. You learned to keep your family's Puritan beliefs deep within your heart, masking them under perfect Latin verses. You realized that in an environment where political views could shift like the wind, prudence was the only shield to protect you. You observed Busby, a man both fearsome and respectable, and wondered, how can one human maintain order and iron discipline amidst a disintegrating world? Is coercion the only way to maintain the stability of a society? Those questions did not stay only on paper. They vibrated right outside your classroom window. London in the late 1640s was no longer just a city. It was a political pressure cooker. The tension between Parliament and King Charles I had reached its peak. You could feel the heat of resentment in the breath of the crowds on the street. Westminster School sat right next to the Houses of Parliament in Whitehall Palace, making you an involuntary witness to history. And then, the 30th of January 1649, arrived a scar that would never heal in your memory. It was a winter day, so cold that the Thames seemed to freeze. A terrifying silence hung over all of Westminster School. You were told to stay in your rooms, but no stone wall could block out the weight of the event unfolding just a few hundred yards away. King Charles I was led to the scaffold at Whitehall. You sat there, your thin hands clasped together, listening to your own breath. And then, a sound rose, not a gunshot, not a scream, but a choked groan from thousands of chests as the axe fell. An old order, a belief in the divine right of kings, was severed in an instant. For you, a 17-year-old, this event was a cognitive shock. You witnessed a king, supposedly God's representative on earth, be tried and executed by his own subjects. Words could kill. Now this phrase carried a chilling meaning. Charles I's death warrant was the result of debates, legal documents, and declarations. You realized that words and ideas were not harmless. They were weapons capable of toppling the firmest thrones. The scar of 1649 etched into your mind a fear of chaos and the fragility of social order. You began to long for a new foundation for power, something more stable than the will of an individual, yet more orderly than the brutality of the mob. After the execution, England entered the Commonwealth era under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Your school became a strange oasis where old traditions still tried to survive in a new reality. You continued to learn, continued to hone ancient languages, but now every page was colored by political reflection. You became an outstanding student, not just because of natural intelligence, but because you understood that knowledge was the only tool to navigate yourself in a world without direction. Your tireless efforts were rewarded. You were elected a King's Scholar, a prestigious title for the most elite students. This was another paradox. You held the title of King's Scholar in a country without a king. You learned to live with these contradictions, turning them into part of your intellectual architecture. You realize that reality is never as simple as theories in books. It is full of gray areas and compromises. Alexander Popham's patronage appeared once more as an invisible hand guiding your destiny. Your brilliant achievements at Westminster, combined with your father's lasting connections, helped you secure a prestigious studentship to Christ Church, Oxford. It was a ticket to go even further into the world of thought and science. As you prepared to leave Westminster in 1652, you stood once again in the shadow of the Abbey. You looked toward Whitehall, where the ghost of the execution still lingered in the air. You were no longer the shy 14-year-old boy of before. You had grown up amidst the fall of the axe and the screams of a revolution. Your mind, that blank slate of years past, was now thick with notes on betrayal, loyalty, power, and fear. What you carried from Westminster was not just fluency in 5 languages, but a deep skepticism toward all forms of absolute power. You understood that neither the tyranny of a king nor the chaos of the mob could bring peace. You began to dimly realize that the solution must lie in something in between: a contract, a consensus, a common reason. The journey to Oxford was not just an academic advancement. It was an escape from Busby's rigid dogmas to find a freer space for thought. You knew that at Oxford, the seeds of thought regarding individual liberty and natural rights would begin to sprout from the scars London had left in you. You walked on, quiet and cautious as always, but in your eyes shone the fire of a quest. You were the architect, gradually gathering the first bricks to build a palace of reason, where humans could live without fearing the breath of another. You walked through the tom-quad gates of Christ Church on an autumn afternoon in 1652, as the final rays of the day gilded the ancient gray stone walls of Oxford. At 20 years old, you found yourself feeling older and more somber than the new students who had just left their families' embrace. Oxford welcomed you not with the bustle of London, but with a silence so profound that one could almost hear the whispers of centuries of knowledge sleeping within the libraries. You took a deep breath, smelling the damp stone, the candle wax, and the old parchment. This was where you would reside, but would it be the place where you found the truth you so longingly craved? Right from the first classes, a sense of boredom began to creep into your mind. You sat in dark lecture halls, listening to professors passionately debating the logic of Aristotle and medieval metaphysical concepts. To you, it all seemed like nothing more than a labyrinth of empty words. They debated how many angels could stand on the head of a needle, or the nature of substance and accidents, without ever touching the reality of life. You realized a bitter paradox. At the world's greatest center of education, people were busy building sandcastles of words rather than learning about the actual world. Scholasticism at that time was like a thick fog covering reason. You found yourself besieged by dry rules of debate, where winning an argument with obscure terminology was valued more than discovering a new truth. Your mind, already trained in prudence from the years of war, now became even more closed off. You did not resist openly. You still completed your essays and participated in debates, but inside, you nurtured a quiet skepticism. You wondered, if knowledge does not help us better understand the world around us or improve human life, then what value does that knowledge have? In February 1656, You received your bachelor's degree B.A., and 2 years later, in June 1658, you officially became a Master of Arts. These degrees were not your ultimate goal, but merely the necessary passports that allowed you to remain at Christ Church, where you had begun to find new oases of thought outside the formal curriculum. During your hours of self-study, you sought out the works of René Descartes. Although you would later spend your life refuting his innate ideas, it was Descartes who first gave you a glimmer of hope. He taught you that philosophy could be clear, transparent, and built upon the firm foundations of reason instead of blind traditions. You read him and felt a sense of liberation. I think, therefore I am. It was a foothold, however fragile, amidst the sea of scholastic darkness. After becoming a master, you began taking on teaching positions at the college, lecturer in Greek, then lecturer in rhetoric, and later, censor of moral philosophy. You stood at the podium, looking at young faces repeating what you had once detested, and you felt a deep, internal torment. According to Oxford statutes, to maintain a long-term teaching position, you were required to take holy orders to become a clergyman. This was a life-or-death crossroads. Becoming a clergyman meant committing yourself to certain religious dogmas, something your freedom of thought could not accept. You did not want your conscience bound by any institution, but if you did not take orders, you would lose your haven at Oxford. In that stalemate, you found an escape. The college statutes allowed a few specialized positions in medicine or law to be exempt from holy orders. And so, you chose medicine. This choice was not just a tactic to keep your place. It was a great redirection of your soul from abstract musings to the tangible reality of flesh and blood. Oxford in the 1660s was not just inhabited by aging professors mumbling about Aristotle. It was also the home of a group of progressive intellects later known as the Invisible College. You began participating in private meetings at Wadham College under the guidance of John Wilkins. Here, you no longer heard debates about metaphysics, but instead, the hiss of air pumps, the smell of sulfur, and the crackle of chemical experiments. You met Robert Boyle, a slender man with eyes glowing with intellect, who would later become your teacher and kindred spirit. Boyle taught you that truth lies not in old books, but in careful observation. You became his assistant in experiments regarding air pressure. Imagine standing in a lab clouded with candle smoke, holding a glass tube, watching air being drawn out of a vessel, seeing small animals stagger and then faint. That was when you realized a great truth. We learn about the world not by deducing from pre-existing principles, but by letting the world act upon our senses. You began to absorb Boyle's corpuscular theory, the idea that all matter is composed of tiny particles whose motion and arrangement create all the characteristics of the world. Boyle's experiments were like a strong wind blowing away the scholastic dust in your head. You began to take notes, not of quotes from saints, but of quantitative data and measurable physical phenomena. You learned to keep a silent observation. This silence was different from the fearful silence of your childhood. This was the silence of a scientist listening to the voice of nature. The passion for experimentation led you deeper into the world of medicine. You befriended Richard Lower, a brilliant anatomist who showed you the complex and miraculous structure of the human body under the scalpel. You saw the heart contracting, saw the tiny blood vessels, and realized that man is the most sophisticated machine of nature. Together with David Thomas, you established a small apothecary shop in Oxford. Here, you were no longer a noble lecturer of moral philosophy. You were a craftsman of knowledge, hands stained with chemicals and medicinal herbs, fascinated by finding remedies that could truly alleviate human pain. During this period, you began to form a new methodology, the natural history method. Instead of trying to explain why a disease exists, according to dogmatic theories of humors, you began to observe how the disease progresses. You recorded every symptom, every minute change in the patient, much like a gardener observes the growth of a tree. You began to believe that the human mind at birth is indeed an absolute blank slate, and all the knowledge we have consists of traces recorded by experience through the senses. The paradox of your life in these years was this: you were living in the most archaic institution to prepare for the most modern ideas. You wore the mask of an exemplary Oxford scholar, teaching subjects you no longer believed in, so that you could silently build a new system of thought in the shadows of the laboratory. The prudence you learned from the Civil War era now became a perfect cover for the quiet revolution in your mind. You realized that words could kill, but silence and observation could save lives. You saw the helplessness of traditional philosophy in the face of real illnesses and social upheavals. You began to long for a practical philosophy, an experimental philosophy that did not just exist in libraries, but stepped out into life, into hospitals, into workshops, and into the political arena. The years at Oxford from 1652 to 1665 were the period that forged a new person within you. You entered as a young man, carrying the scars of the past, and you were preparing to emerge as a thinker, carrying blueprints for the future. You had learned to discard the beautiful illusions of words to face the naked reality of things. You had chosen medicine not just to treat the body, but to seek a remedy for the blindness of the human intellect. Under the archstone vaults of Christ Church, amidst the somber bell tolls of the great Tom Tower, you were silently accumulating a new kind of weapon. It was not your father's sword, nor was it Busby's birch rod. It was the power of experience. You understood that every small observation, every quantitative data point, every natural phenomenon was a stone building the foundation for true freedom. The freedom rooted in understanding the nature of things, instead of being led by dark dogmas. In the summer of 1665, a pandemic began to threaten London, and new upheavals were about to strike. You stood at the door of your laboratory in Oxford, looking at your test tubes and manuscripts, feeling that you were ready. The years of formal study had ended, giving way to a life of engagement. You were no longer afraid of the dark, because you had learned how to light the candle of experimental reason. And in light, flickering yet steady, you saw the silhouette of a new world waiting to be explored. A world where humans are no longer slaves to empty concepts, but masters of their own experience and thought. Are you ready to leave the safety of the lecture hall to enter the upcoming political storms with a man who will completely change your destiny, Lord Ashley? In the summer of 1666, a sweltering heat enveloped the spires of Oxford, bringing with it a heavy dampness from the Thames. You were still immersed in medical experiments and unfinished manuscripts at Christ Church, believing that your life would forever be tied to the silence of the lecture halls and the scent of medicinal herbs in the apothecary. But destiny, sometimes, is written from the smallest of incidents. You did not know that a bottle of mineral water broken during transport would become the bridge leading you into the eye of the storm of English political history. Your close friend, Dr. David Thomas, was tasked with preparing Astrop mineral water to treat a high-ranking figure, Lord Ashley, also known as Anthony Ashley Cooper, a sharp and powerful politician. Due to an urgent matter, Thomas asked you to supervise the delivery, but when the mineral water arrived, the bottles had shattered. You, with your inherent prudence and self-respect, decided to meet Ashley in person to apologize for the delay. In the luxurious room where the nobleman was staying, the moment your eyes met Ashley's, an instant connection ignited. Ashley did not see in you a clumsy messenger, but rather a sharp intellect hidden behind a calm exterior, a man capable of perceiving the laws of nature and humanity. I see in you a man who not only knows how to heal the body, but also how to heal a nation. Those were the words Ashley might have thought while conversing with you for hours about philosophy, politics, and science. That chance encounter sparked a new fire within you. Ashley, a man of action and strategy, was exactly the missing piece for your theoretical reflections. You found in him a powerful patron, a kindred intellect, and a door opening to the reality you had always longed to explore. A year later, in 1667, you packed your parchment books and test tubes at Oxford to move to London. You entered Exeter House, Ashley's magnificent mansion, not just as a personal physician, but as a secretary, a political advisor, a tutor, and a confidant. London welcomed you with its frantic pace, with the scent of power and thick political intrigues. Here, you no longer sat behind the stone walls of the university to observe the world. You were standing right at the center of the machine that ran that world. You learned to listen to negotiations about trade, colonies, and religion issues that scholastic philosophy had never touched. But the real challenge for your presence at Exeter House came from a life and death crisis. In 1668, Lord Ashley's health collapsed severely. A liver abscess, the result of a hydatid cyst, was silently ravaging his body. The most famous doctors of the time shook their heads in dismay. They only proposed traditional methods like bloodletting, methods that you knew well would only further exhaust a dying life. Facing the fragility of life, you made the boldest decision of your career. Based on experimental research with Robert Boyle and the meticulous observation you learned from medicine, you proposed an unprecedented surgery, an operation to drain the abscess. It was a gamble with death. In an era where anesthesia and germ theory did not yet exist, every incision could be a death sentence. But you believed in experience, in what your eyes had observed on the anatomical dissecting table. Imagine standing in a room filled with candlelight, Ashley's breathing heavy and intermittent. You supervised the surgeons, guiding them to make an incision into your master's body. A suffocating silence hung in the air as the purulent fluid began to drain. To ensure the abscess did not recur, you implemented a symbolic solution, inserting a silver tube into the incision for continuous drainage. The surgery was a brilliant success. Lord Ashley was resurrected from the brink of death. That silver tube was not just a medical device. It became an invisible but unbreakable bond between you and Ashley. For the rest of his life, he carried that tube within him as a reminder of the life you had given back to him. You have not only saved my life, but you have reborn my soul. From that moment, Ashley's trust in you was absolute. He no longer saw you as a servant, but as an architect in the shadows, the one who would draft the future of England with him. Amidst the busyness at Ashley's residence, you did not forget your passion for experimental science. In November 1668, you were officially elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. Here, you no longer had to meet secretly in the Invisible College as you did at Oxford. You stood as an equal to Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and the most brilliant minds of the age. You exchanged ideas, debated, and together built a new era of reason. But there was one person in London who completely changed your approach to medicine: Dr. Thomas Sydenham. Sydenham was a worshipper of clinical observation. He taught you that diseases were not abstract concepts in textbooks, but vivid entities with their own histories. Together with Sydenham, you went to the bedsides of London's poorest, meticulously recording every manifestation of fever, every nuance of the skin. The combination of your philosophical intellect and Sydenham's practical methods created a profound experimental mindset. You realized that true knowledge does not come from top-down deductions, but must be built from the smallest pieces of experience. The paradox of your life began to emerge clearly during this period, as you became more deeply involved in Ashley's political activities. As secretary to the Lords Proprietors of the Carolina Colony, in 1669, you put pen to paper to participate in drafting the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. In the quiet of your study, you wrote lines about religious freedom and effective governance. But right alongside those ideals, a large scar appeared on the page of your history. Article 110 of that Constitution clearly stated, "Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves." This was a heart-wrenching, tragic contrast. How could a man who was silently building a theory of individual liberty, a man who had witnessed the death of a king to demand rights for the people, sign a document legalizing slavery? This internal torment was perhaps the shadow covering the light of your reason. Perhaps at that time, you viewed slavery as an unavoidable economic reality of the age, or perhaps you were compromising with the immediate interests of your patron, Ashley. Whatever the reason, this contradiction transformed you from a pure symbol of freedom into a flawed and conflicted human being. Words could liberate, but words could also shackle. The Carolina Constitution was a double-edged weapon that you had inadvertently forged in the dark. The years from 1666 to 1670 transformed you completely. From a cautious and reclusive Oxford scholar, you became a figure intertwined with actual political power. You had learned to use the scalpel to save a man's life, and use the pen to draft the structure of a new society, even if that society still bore the heavy injustices of the era. You walked the halls of power in London, feeling the heartbeat of an empire in formation, and understood that your philosophy could not remain solely in contemplation. You realized that every action of yours, from the surgery for Ashley to the drafting of laws for the colony, were experiments in reality. Your life at this time was like a giant laboratory where you were testing theories about human nature and power. Your silence now took on a new color. It was the silence of a man holding state secrets, of a man who understood that what he wrote down today could change the fate of millions later. You stood by the window of Exeter House, looking out at the Thames, shimmering under the London moonlight, and wondered about the seeds of freedom you were sowing. Would they bloom in justice, or would they be strangled by the very shackles you helped create? The silver tube inside Ashley still throbbed with pain whenever the weather changed, like a reminder that every salvation comes with a price, and every freedom is built on the scars of history. You knew that your journey with Ashley was only beginning. Greater political storms awaited ahead, where your loyalty and ideals would be placed on the scale once more. But for now, let yourself rest in the silence of the library, where the ideas of a blank slate were gradually taking clearer shape through every real-world experience. You were no longer an observer standing on the sidelines. You were part of the flow of history, and every line of ink you wrote was slowly becoming a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment to fire and redefine the world. In the winter of 1671, London was submerged in a frigid mist, thick with coal smoke. In your private room at Exeter House, Flickering candlelight cast long shadows across bookshelves laden with manuscripts and medical specimens. You sat there with 5 or 6 close friends, including James Tyrrell, gathered around a large oak table. With half-burned pipes, the warmth of wine, and the fervor of minds eager to find answers to humanity's most baffling problems, morality and revealed religion. However, that initially enthusiastic discussion quickly fell into a dark impasse. Every argument raised met another contradiction. Every step forward seemed to pull you all deeper into a labyrinth of abstract concepts with no escape. You saw the confusion evident on the faces of your friends. In that prolonged moment of silence, a sudden flash of insight struck your mind. You realized that you had all been too hasty in building the castle of knowledge without ever examining its foundation. You stood up, walked toward the window, looking out over the London streets shrouded in darkness, and uttered an idea that would forever change the course of Western philosophy. Before we set loose our thoughts upon such inquiries, it was necessary to examine our own abilities and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with. That evening, after your friends had departed, you remained at your writing desk. Hasty and undigested thoughts began to flow onto the paper. You did not intend to write a monumental work. You only sought a compass for the mind. Yet, from those scribbles on scrap paper, drafts A and B of an essay concerning human understanding took shape. You began to reinterrogate the concept of the blank slate tabula rasa that you had first sparked during your time at Oxford. If the mind is a dark, empty room, how does light enter it? You began to sketch the diagram of perception, that nothing is in the understanding which was not first in the senses. This was the beginning of a solitary and persistent journey spanning nearly 2 decades, where you would become the surveyor of the limits of human intellect. However, your life did not allow you to be merely a reclusive philosopher. The world of action and power of Lord Ashley, now the Earl of Shaftesbury, constantly pulled you into its violent vortices. From 1673 to 1675, you served as the secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations. This was a significant position, placing you in the role of a global observer. On your desk lay not only philosophical manuscripts, but also colonial maps, shipping reports, and the balance sheets of an empire stretching across the oceans. You read about sugar plantations in Barbados, the tobacco trade in Virginia, and the wild lands of Carolina. This role shaped within you a pragmatic economic view. You realized that a nation's freedom was tied to the prosperity of its trade. Yet, it was here that a deep shadow began to loom over your career. As secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, you continued to participate in the management and revision of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. The most painful paradox appeared right beneath your pen. While in the evenings you wrestled with natural rights and human liberty in the manuscript of the essay, during the day you copied and refined Article 110. Every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. You did not stop at writing. Around 1672, you invested a significant sum of money in the Royal African Company, which held the monopoly on the slave trade. How can one reconcile the John Locke, who would later be hailed as the father of liberalism, being so deeply involved in the institution of slavery? Was your mind divided into 2 isolated halves at that time? Or did you view slaves as a type of property outside the scope of the natural rights you were defining? This is the largest scar in your biography, a tragic contradiction showing that even the greatest minds can be blinded by the practical interests and prejudices of their era. Your words on freedom seem to be standing on a foundation built with the chains of others. Amidst political busyness and quiet torments, you did not forget your identity as a physician. After years of informal study, finally, in February 1675, at the age of 43, you officially received your Bachelor of Medicine from Oxford University. This degree was not just a recognition of the surgical talent that had saved Shaftesbury years ago, but also a talisman that would allow you to practice medicine properly if political upheavals ousted you from Exeter House. And that upheaval came sooner than you expected. In 1674, Shaftesbury's political fortunes reversed. He fell from favor, was stripped of his government positions, and became the target of royal suspicion. At the same time, your health collapsed. The hereditary asthma from your childhood flared up violently in the polluted air of London. The bouts of breathlessness made your chest tighten, and you understood that you needed a change both in politics and climate. In late 1675, you decided to leave England for France. This departure was both for healing and for hiding, while the giant Shaftesbury was temporarily unhorsed. You set foot in Montpellier, southern France, where the sky was bright blue and the Mediterranean air was dry. Here, your lungs could finally breathe with more ease. Montpellier was not just a medical stopover, it was a new school for your mind. You met French intellectuals and participated in debates on experimental medicine and science. You spent time researching the plight of the Protestants Huguenots in France. In the context where the Edict of Nantes was still in effect, you observed the fragile coexistence between different faiths under the power of a Catholic king. These observations began to sow in your heart the seeds of toleration, a subject you would later develop into a groundbreaking work. During your days in France, you spent hours in libraries reading deeply into René Descartes in his own homeland. You still admired his clarity, but now, with a wealth of practical experience from medicine to politics, you felt even more that Descartes' theory of innate ideas was a false imposition upon the human mind. You wrote more pages for your manuscript, arguing that all of man's most complex notions are built from the simplest sensations, simple ideas. You likened the mind to a mirror. It cannot create images on its own. It only reflects what the outside world displays before it. You lived in France from 1675 to 1678 as an intellectual wanderer. You traveled from Montpellier through Lyon to Paris, meeting talented scientists like Nicolas Toynard. In the absolute silence of these years of voluntary exile, an essay concerning human understanding began to emerge from fragmented scraps into a coherent system of thought. You were no longer in a hurry. You understood that a great idea needs time to ripen, much like the way you observed a disease progress. The prudence you learned from your childhood during the English Civil War had now become an art of living. In France, you used aliases in some correspondence, kept sensitive political manuscripts hidden, and always maintained the appearance of a physician seeking relaxation. You knew that back home, Shaftesbury was quietly preparing for a return, and when that time came, you would again be pulled into the vortex of power. But for now, under the brilliant sun of Montpellier, you allowed yourself to be a truly free man in thought. How could a man who participated in drafting slave laws write such exquisite words on epistemology and human liberty? Perhaps that contradiction was the very nature of the human being you were trying to discover? You looked at yourself, at the scars of history, and the ambitions of the present, and continued to write. You understood that knowledge is not a gift fallen from heaven, but a relentless struggle of reason against darkness and prejudice. You stood on a balcony in Paris in 1678, looking toward the horizon where England waited. You carried in your luggage not just prescriptions or money from slave stocks, but a growing manuscript, a manuscript that would soon become a loaded weapon against tyranny. You were ready to return, not just as the physician to an earl, but as the one who would redraw the boundaries of intellect and power for the entire modern world. The London fog might again make your lungs ache, but the fire from the ideas you nurtured in France would never go out. You knew that your silence over the past 3 years was about to be replaced by a resonance greater than ever. Shaftesbury returned to power in 1679, and destiny was beckoning you back to the center of the storm. You returned to England in the spring of 1679, when the cold winds from the North Sea still whistled through the alleys of London, carrying the scent of instability and the breath of a crisis waiting to explode. After 3 years of breathing the air of freedom and silence in France, you stepped off the pier and immediately felt an unusual heat, not the heat of the Montpellier sun, but the heat emanating from pamphlets, fiery debates in coffee houses, and the suspicious gazes of guards. You were no longer a wandering guest. You had returned to the eye of the storm. Your patron, the Earl of Shaftesbury, was now no longer a disgraced nobleman. He had returned, stronger and more determined than ever, leading the opposition, the Whig Party, in a life-or-death confrontation with the Crown. The exclusion crisis was tearing the country apart. The question posed was grim. Would James, Duke of York, a devout Catholic and the King's brother, be allowed to succeed to the throne? For Shaftesbury and the Whigs, a Catholic king was not just a matter of religion. It was the embodiment of French-style tyranny, the end of parliamentary liberty, and the ghost of ancient persecutions. You entered Exeter House once again, but this time, the mansion was no longer a peaceful library. It had become a political war headquarters. You moved through those corridors like an invisible architect. While Shaftesbury shouted in the halls of Parliament and mobilized crowds in the streets, you sat quietly in the dark corner of your office, drafting strategic documents, analyzing legal precedents, and advising on the boldest of plans. You learned to keep silent for survival, never signing your name to any sensitive documents. You understood that in this era, a misplaced stroke of ink could become a noose around your neck.
But in the silence of your room late at night, you were doing something many times more dangerous than that.
You began writing 2 treatises of government. Imagine sitting at your oak desk, your ears listening for the hoofbeats of the King's patrols echoing on the street, your hand trembling slightly as you set pen to paper. This work was not a dry philosophical essay to be stored in libraries. It was a propaganda weapon, a loaded weapon designed to fire at the very foundations of absolute monarchy. You knew that you were committing an act of treason. If this manuscript were discovered, you would have no chance of defense. You would be hanged, drawn, and quartered like any rebel. The great paradox of your life rose again. You, the most cautious man in the world, who always worshipped order and peace, were secretly drafting the theory justifying armed uprising and even the deposition of a king. Fear lingered in every breath, but reason compelled you to continue. You understood that words could kill, but words left unwritten could kill an entire nation. In the first treatise, you swung the sword of reason at Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, the bedside book for those who supported the divine right of kings. You meticulously broke the screeded argument that political power was granted by God to Adam, and from there, passed down to kings as an absolute paternal right. You wrote with sharp irony, "If the power of kings be the paternal power of Adam, how shall we know who is his true heir among the millions on earth?" You were destroying the theological shackles binding the human mind to blind obedience. But it was in the second treatise, that you truly laid the foundation for the modern world. You invited listeners to return to a state of nature, a state of perfect freedom and equality. You argued that humans are not born as anyone's subjects. They are masters of themselves. Each person possesses inalienable natural rights, life, liberty, and estate. You wrote, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and that law is reason." You built the concept of the social contract. Government was not established by God, but was a tool created by humans through consent to protect their natural rights. This was the crux of the loaded weapon. If a government becomes tyrannical, if it violates the very purpose for which it was created, then the contract is torn up. At that point, the people have not only the right, but the obligation to dissolve the government and rebel. Whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. Writing these lines amidst the crisis of 1681 was an incredibly dramatic act. The Whigs, after failing to pass the Exclusion Bill in Parliament, began to consider final measures. Secret meetings, assassination plots, coup plans. You stood on the edge of all of it. You saw your friends sharpening their swords, while you were sharpening ideas. You understood that ideas can escape, transcending the stone walls of Exeter House to become a fire burning in the hearts of the masses. In 1681, King Charles II counterattacked. He dissolved Parliament at Oxford, the very place where you had once studied, and began a brutal campaign of purges. Shaftesbury was arrested and sent to the Tower of London on charges of treason. You stood in the middle of London, feeling the ground beneath your feet shaking. Every knock on the door made your heart tighten. You began destroying sensitive letters, encrypting notes, and living in extreme vigilance. The king's spies lingered everywhere, tracking every footstep of Shaftesbury's personal physician. Shaftesbury was acquitted by a London jury in July 1681, to the cheers of the crowd. But that victory was only temporary. The king never forgot and never forgave. Pressure continued to mount. Whig plots began to leak. You saw despair evident on the face of your patron. He was no longer a calm politician. He was a wild beast driven into a corner. In November 1682, realizing that death was imminent if he remained in England, Shaftesbury made a secret escape to Holland. You stayed in England for a short time longer, and these were the darkest days. You were alone in your room, surrounded by manuscripts that could cost you your head. Shaftesbury died in Amsterdam only a few months after his flight, leaving you without your final shield of protection. You saw your comrades being led to the scaffold one by one. Algernon Sidney, who also wrote about freedom, was executed for his own unpublished manuscripts. You realized that your pages were no longer philosophy. They were evidence of a crime. The silence enveloping your life now carried the heavy taste of death. You learned to trust no one. You changed your lodgings constantly, moving like a ghost between London and Oxford. You observed how the crown re-established order through blood and fear. The scar from the execution of King Charles I in 1649 throbbed again. The cycle of history seemed to be repeating, but this time, the axe was pointed toward people like you. How could a man too cautious to admit his own words become the voice of liberation across 3 centuries? The answer lay in your very torment at this moment. You did not write for fame. You wrote for the survival of reason. You understood that if you were caught, these ideas would be incinerated along with your body. You had to live, not for yourself, but for the 2 treatises lying coiled in the secret compartments of your wooden chest. Those ideas needed a living author, so they could one day cross oceans and topple kings. In the summer of 1683, as the London air became stifling with raids,
You understood that your time was up. You prepared for an exile.
You did not bring much, besides a few sets of medical clothes and your most precious manuscripts, carefully hidden.
You looked back at Exeter House for the last time, the place that had once been the center of dreams for a free England, now nothing more than the ashes of political hopes. You stepped down into a small boat at the port, preparing to cross the channel to Holland. The sound of waves lapping against the hull was like the beat of a fearful heart. You wondered if you would ever return to your homeland, or if you would vanish like a ghost in a foreign land. But in your heart, 2 treatises of government still hummed like a promise. You had finished writing the most powerful arguments for freedom, even as you were fleeing because of that very freedom. The silver tube inside Shaftesbury had perhaps stopped draining, but the ideas that he and you had nurtured together were beginning an independent life. Words once written escaped their authors. You sat in the dark cabin of the ship, feeling the swaying of the ocean, and began to accept the destiny of an exile. You would live in the shadows in Holland, use aliases, burn letters, and maintain absolute silence. But you knew that your loaded weapon was being carefully preserved, waiting for the moment when history was ready for it to fire. You closed your eyes, listened to the waves, and let your mind return to the state of a blank slate, ready for new experiences in a new land. The most arduous journey of your life had only just begun, and the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and sometimes eternal solitude. You stand on the deck of the ship, your worn cloak fluttering in the biting wind of the North Sea. Behind you, the white reefs of the English coast recede into the thick fog, as if your home island were intentionally erasing the tracks of a rebel. Ahead, Holland emerges through the mist of the canals, a low-lying land, yet the only remaining sanctuary for hunted ideas. You carry nothing but a small trunk filled with manuscripts that could cost you your head and a fear that has become instinctual. You understand that, in the eyes of King Charles II and the Stuart Court, you are no longer a brilliant physician or a respected Oxford philosopher. You are a ghost of the Whig Party, a confidant of the late Shaftesbury, and worse still, you are suspected of being involved in the Rye House plot, the plan to assassinate the king and his brother. Although your hands are only accustomed to holding pens and medical scalpels and have never touched the gunpowder or swords of assassins, in an age where suspicion reigns, your words are ironclad evidence. You witnessed Algernon Sidney being led to the scaffold solely for unpublished manuscript pages. You deeply understand the grim truth. Words could kill. To protect your great ideas, you were forced to let yourself die first. When you stepped into Amsterdam in September 1683, the John Locke of England vanished. In his place was a quiet man, bearing the appearance of a humble physician with a pseudonym, Dr. van der Linden. This is the greatest paradox of your life. The man drafting the most powerful arguments for human liberty must live in the shackles of anonymity. You learn to change lodgings constantly, from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, then drifting to Utrecht. Every knock on the door at midnight made your heart tighten. Every unfamiliar gaze on the street made you shudder at the thought of the English Crown's spy network surrounding Europe. Absolute silence became the only shell that allowed you to survive. In Holland, in cramped lodgings overlooking stagnant canals, you began the life of an exile. In 1684, news from home struck like a knife. By order of the king, Oxford University officially stripped you of your studentship. The only intellectual home you ever had turned its back on you. But it was precisely in that solitude and rejection that your mind became freer than ever. You realized that when there is nothing left to lose, one is left only with the truth. Holland at that time was an oasis of reason, a gathering place for exiled intellectuals from across the continent, an entity you all called the Republic of Letters. You found solace in your friendship with Benjamin Furley, an open-minded Quaker, and Philip van Limborch, a learned theologian. During evenings by candlelight at Furley's house, as the scent of tea and old paper filled the space, you were no longer the hunted. You were a member of a borderless community where the only weapon was argument and the only goal was enlightenment. It was here, witnessing the stream of Huguenots French Protestants pouring into Holland in a state of exhaustion after King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, that your heart wrenched. You saw broken families, eyes hollow from persecution solely because of religious beliefs. The rhetorical question echoed in your mind: how can a government, in the name of faith, act with such brutality? In that quiet outrage, you set pen to paper to write Epistula de Tolerantia, a letter concerning toleration. You wrote in Latin, the language of the global intelligentsia, to hide your identity, but to spread the idea as far as possible. You argued that the state and the church are two separate entities with completely different purposes. The care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate. You emphasized a simple yet shocking truth. Belief is something that cannot be coerced by swords or burning stakes. It must stem from the internal persuasion of the mind. Toleration is not a favor granted by the strong to the weak, but a natural right of every rational human being. This work, like a loaded weapon, was sent to Limborch with a vow of absolute secrecy. You did not sign your name. You refused to claim it as yours, even to your closest friends. You understood that words once spoken escape their authors, and sometimes the author must recede into the shadows so the idea can shine. At the same time, in the quiet hours between flights, you continued to polish the masterpiece of your life. An essay concerning human understanding. Holland gave you the time that Oxford and London had snatched away. You revisited the pages of drafts A and B, stained by time since 1671. You rewrote, corrected, cut, and added new observations from medicine and your life in exile. You wanted to build a map for the human mind, proving that we do not have innate ideas engraved by God or a king. Everything begins with a blank slate. You spent months summarizing your thoughts into a 50-page French manuscript for publication in the Bibliothèque Universelle. You observed the reaction of the European intelligentsia to your ideas like a scientist. Observing a chemical reaction, you saw debates begin to erupt. Your ideas were beginning to cross oceans, creeping into tea rooms in Paris and lecture halls in Germany, even though people only knew the author as a mysterious English philosopher. The life of Dr. van der Linden was full of tragic paradoxes. While you wrote about the absolute freedom of the mind, you had to live under the strict control of fear. You had to burn letters from England immediately after reading them and use codes to communicate with old comrades. The scar from the execution of King Charles I and the fall of Shaftesbury always throbbed with pain whenever you heard news of a friend being arrested. The prudence you learned from childhood had now become a second skin. You never declared it, you never signed your name, but you never stopped fighting with your pen. In 1685, King Charles II passed away, and James II ascended the throne. The rule of this Catholic king was exactly what you and Shaftesbury had feared: increased repression, narrowed freedoms. In Holland, a community of English exiles began to gather around William of Orange, the ruler of Holland and son-in-law of James II. You stood in the shadows of these discussions. You were not a sword-wielding warrior, but you were the architect behind the scenes, providing the theoretical foundation for a great change. The manuscripts of 2 treatises of government that you had brought from England were now further perfected. You added chapters on the dissolution of government, on the right to rebellion when the social contract is broken. You did not write about a bloody revolution. You wrote about the return of rational order. You understood that words could topple kings if those words truly reflected the heart of the people and the laws of nature. In November 1688, the wind began to blow in a direction favorable to the revolutionaries. William of Orange landed on the English coast with an army and a promise to protect liberty and the Protestant faith. The glorious revolution took place without the horrific massacres of the Civil War era you once witnessed. James II fled, and a new era began. But you did not rush back immediately. With prudence ingrained in your blood, you waited until you were certain that the ground at home had truly stabilized. It was not until February 1689 that you stepped onto the ship Isabella, along with Princess Mary, William's wife, soon to be Queen Mary II. Imagine standing on the deck of the Isabella, looking toward the horizon, where the white cliffs of Dover are gradually appearing through the morning mist. 6 years of exile have ended. You left as a hunted criminal and returned on the same ship as the one who holds the crown. But in your heart, you know you are not returning to seek personal glory or power. You return as the one carrying the seeds of a new world. In your trunk, the completed manuscripts are no longer hasty and undigested scraps. They have been tempered through the furnace of persecution, refined by the silence of Holland, and enriched by the experience of an exile. An essay concerning human understanding, a letter concerning toleration, and 2 treatises of government, this trio of rational weapons is ready to fire. As the ship docks, you take a deep breath of English air. It still smells of the sea and coal smoke as it did the day you left, but for the first time in decades, you feel your chest is no longer tightened by fear. You look down at your hands, the hands that wrote the lines that will change the fate of millions, from distant colonies in America to the palaces of Europe. How did a man too cautious to admit his own words become the voice of liberation across 3 centuries? The answer lies in these 6 years of exile. Holland was not just a sanctuary. It was the laboratory where you verified that even when a man is stripped of his name, position, and homeland, reason and conscience remain unbeatable fortresses. You step off the pier, John Locke once again, but a John Locke ready to be silent no longer. The revolution on the ground has succeeded, but the revolution in the human consciousness, of which you are the chief architect, is only now truly beginning to spread. Your unsigned manuscripts are waiting for the printing press. They will escape you, crossing oceans and centuries, to remind humans that they are born free and equal, and no crown has the right to imprison their souls. You smile, a rare and discreet smile, and then take steady steps into the heart of a reviving England. The ship Isabella cut through the waves, bringing you back to Greenwich Harbor on a February morning in 1689. Standing on the deck beside Princess Mary, you felt the air of England fill your chest, still the same briny salt of the sea and the familiar scent of coal, but this time, it no longer carried the bitter taste of fear. 6 years of exile had ended. You left in the darkness as a criminal, and returned in the dawn of a new era as a companion to the future queen. The glorious revolution had been completed without the bloody massacres you had always dreaded. Order had been re-established, not by the divine right of kings, but by the power of reason and consent. You stepped down onto the pier, your feet touching the soil of your homeland after years of wandering. Now, you were no longer the anonymous Dr. van der Linden.
You were John Locke, a respected figure, a confidant to those who held the new power. The new government was eager to have your service. They offered you the posts of ambassador to Vienna, then to Brandenburg, prestigious diplomatic positions that could have placed you at the center of the European stage. But you, with the insight of one who had tasted enough of life's ups and downs, refused them all. My lungs will not permit me to endure long journeys in the cold of the north. Your health, depleted after years of living in hiding, had become a brake on your political ambitions. You chose for yourself a humbler position, Commissioner of Appeals, a job that allowed you to stay in London to fulfill a much grander mission, bringing your intellectual children out of the shadows. This was a moment of intellectual explosion. In less than 2 years, from 1689 to 1690, you launched an all-out assault on the old systems of thought, using the manuscripts that had been sharpened in the darkness of your exile. The first work to appear was A Letter Concerning Toleration. Initially printed in Latin to maintain discretion, its heat quickly spread, and it was translated into English. You argued that the government has no authority over the souls of men. The Commonwealth seems to me to be a society of men constituted only for the procuring, preserving, and advancing their own civil interests. However, even in your most progressive thoughts on toleration, the scars of the past remained etched upon your pages. You refused to extend that toleration to Catholics and to atheists because you believed that oaths meant nothing to one who does not believe in God. This was the paradox of liberty. Even the architect of modern toleration could not completely escape the political prejudices of his time. You opened the door to religious freedom, but kept a few latches in place. And then, your most important work, your loaded weapon, was fired. 2 treatises of government. Even though the regime of William and Mary was secure, even though old enemies had fled, the prudence that had seeped into your marrow made you decide to publish it anonymously. You did not sign your name on the cover. You refused to acknowledge it even as it was becoming the Bible of the Whig Party. What were you afraid of? Was it the fear that the wheels of history might reverse once more, and these words justifying rebellion would again become your death warrant? Or did you want your ideas to live an independent life, unbound by the identity of an individual? Words once spoken escape their authors. In that book, you boldly declared to the world, no one is born with the mark of a slave, and no king is born with innate power. Government is merely a trustee, and if that trustee betrays the trust of the people have the right to revoke that power. You transformed abstract concepts of the social contract into real political weapons. These pages did not bear your name, but they carried your soul, and they were beginning to cross oceans to ignite the fires of revolution in far-off lands. In contrast to the anonymity of your political works, you bravely placed your name upon your philosophical masterpiece, an essay concerning human understanding. Perhaps because you believed that inquiries into the nature of perception did not carry the scent of the gallows. You officially declared war on Descartes' theory of innate ideas. You asked your audience to look into their own minds and realize, let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters. Every piece of knowledge you have, every thought you carry, is the result of the ink marks that experience has written upon that blank slate through the senses. You transformed humans from beings destined by fate into free subjects, self-creating through the experience of the world. But while your mind was at the peak of wisdom, your body was surrendering to the harshness of London,
Coal smoke from tens of thousands of fireplaces mingled with the thick fog of the Thames to create a dense atmosphere that stifled your asthmatic lungs. The coughing fits lasted all night, making sleep impossible, making every breath a battle. London, the center of the power you had long yearned to change, was now killing you. Words could save a nation, but they could not heal lungs ravaged by smog and fear. In 1691, a gentle hand reached out to save you. It was Damaris Cudworth Masham, Lady Masham, your confidant, your intellectual soulmate with whom you had shared deep emotional stirrings before your exile. She and her husband, Sir Francis Masham, invited you to live permanently at the Oates estate in Essex. Leaving behind the clamor of London, you found in Oates an earthly paradise. The fresh country air, the scent of new grass, and the stillness of the fields soothed your exhausted lungs. You moved there, bringing your vast library and unfinished manuscripts, beginning a new chapter that was peaceful yet no less productive. At Oates, Damaris was not just a hostess. She was an intellectual companion on par with you. In a study filled with sunlight, you and she discussed her father's philosophy, Ralph Cudworth, and your new ideas. She cared for you with patience and understanding, helping you through those winter nights when breathing was difficult. It was in the warmth of this friendship that you realized true freedom is not just a political right, but the peace of soul found beside those who understand you. Despite failing health, your hands never stopped writing. In 1693, you published Some Thoughts Concerning Education. You were no longer discussing the great affairs of the nation, but returned to the very first bricks that build a human being, the education of children. You remembered the years of being molded under Headmaster Busby's birch rod at Westminster and determined to propose a different path. A child is to be led by habit and good example rather than by the rod and fear. You believed that education was not about cramming empty scholastic knowledge, but about training the body, virtue, and the capacity for independent reasoning. You wanted the future generations of England to have blank slates filled with healthy experiences, rather than the scars of abuse. The obsession with reasonableness continued to lead you into the realm of religion. In 1695, you anonymously published The Reasonableness of Christianity. You attempted a seemingly impossible task, reconciling experimental reason with revealed faith. You stripped away all the complex dogmas of the churches, keeping only the simplest core: belief in Jesus as the Messiah and adherence to moral rules. Christianity is a religion of clarity and simplicity, suited to the understanding of even the common people. But ironically, this effort at reconciliation pushed you into a new war. Conservative theologians accused you of Socinianism, denying the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Once again, you had to resort to silence and anonymity to protect yourself. Fierce debates erupted, and you found yourself caught between two lines of fire. On one side were the religious extremists who saw you as a heretic, and on the other were the atheists who saw you as a coward. You smiled bitterly, understanding that silence is sometimes the loudest resonance of truth. Even in the driest of matters like economics, you left the mark of an experimental mind. When England faced a currency crisis and inflation, you wrote treatises on the recoining of silver money. You opposed the lowering of interest rates by law, arguing that the value of currency must follow the natural laws of the market rather than the will of the monarch. You saw money not just as a piece of metal, but as a vessel of trust and contract between people. The period of 1689-1695 transformed you from an exile living in the shadows into the intellectual architect of an age. You gave the world the blueprints for free government, diagrams of human perception, and humane methods of education. But the paradox remained. You were the man who brought freedom to an entire nation, yet you could not free yourself from the fear of signing your name to your own political works. You were the one who defined understanding, yet you could not understand why your lungs betrayed you at the very moment you were most welcomed. You stood by the window of the Oates estate, looking out over the Essex fields sinking into the autumn sunset of 1695. The books that bore your name and those that did not were beginning their own journeys through the libraries of Paris, the coffee houses of Amsterdam, and the log cabins of the American colonies. They had escaped you, and you knew they would outlive even your weakest breath. You had fulfilled your mission. You had lit the candle of reason amidst the darkness of fanaticism. Though your body was gradually vanishing with every cough, your ideas were becoming living entities, the architects in the shadows, who would continue to build the palace of modern freedom. You closed your eyes, listening to the birdsong outside the gardens of Oates, and felt peace upon the blank slate of your life, which had now been filled with the most brilliant and painful experiences of history. In 1696, as the pale rays of spring sunlight struggled to pierce the thick London fog, you found yourself standing at the peak of a kind of power that you had previously only dared to dream of or secretly sketch in anonymous manuscripts. King William III, whom you had accompanied on the ship returning from Holland, re-established the Board of Trade. And you, John Locke, were no longer an exiled scholar fleeing under a pseudonym, but were appointed as the most powerful member of this board. You entered the solemn meeting rooms, where giant world maps were spread across oak tables, carrying the responsibility of a primary architect for the colonial policy of an entire empire reaching out across the oceans. This was another great paradox of your life. You, the man who spent a lifetime proving that political power must be based on the consent of the governed, now held the power of life and death over distant lands you had never set foot upon. The board of where you work, D was likened to the governing body of America even before the American Revolution broke out. You sat there, amidst the scent of printing ink and candle wax, overseeing everything from the Irish wool trade to the pursuit of pirates across the oceans, and enforcing the harsh navigation acts to ensure that every drop of sweat from the colonists flowed into the coffers of the mother country. Among the thick stacks of reports on your desk, you paid special attention to Virginia. In 1698, you took up your pen to draft a bold reform plan for this region. You wanted to centralize power, increase control over tobacco exports, and closely integrate the duties of the Church of England. You called it the process of civilizing the colonists to counter French influence. But look closely at the words you wrote. Did that civilization truly bring freedom, or was it merely a more sophisticated form of rule? A way to force the blank slates of the new continent to record according to London's will? And then, the largest scar bled again. As a colonial administrator, you directly supervised the relationship with the Royal African Company. You managed an economic system whose gears were lubricated by the blood and tears of slaves. How could a man who wrote such powerful words on life, liberty, and property calmly sign documents operating an empire that denied those very rights to black and indigenous peoples? This tragic contradiction loomed over your office in London like a ghost. You were the architect of modern freedom, but simultaneously the builder of the empire's prison walls. Words could liberate, but your administrative actions were establishing practical shackles. While straining under the weight of national affairs, another war broke out, this time on the intellectual front. Edward Stillingfleet, Bishop of Worcester, a powerful theologian, launched a direct assault on an essay concerning human understanding. Stillingfleet, did not use swords. He used religious dogmas to allege that your empiricism was a dangerous seed leading to atheism. The bishop argued with a forceful tone. If there are no innate ideas engraved by God in the heart, if all knowledge comes only from sensory experience, then how can humans prove the existence of the Trinity or the immortality of the soul? To Stillingfleet, your philosophy was like a surgical scalpel, cutting into the very heart of the Christian faith. You found yourself pulled into a verbal duel that lasted for 3 years, 1696, 1699. You wrote 3 long and detailed letters in rebuttal, affirming that reason and faith are not in conflict, but are 2 currents flowing toward the same truth. Relying on evidence does not deny the existence of God. The debate with Stillingfleet not only exhausted your intellect, but also ravaged the last of your strength. Every reply letter was an instance where you had to stay up all night by the oil lamp while your chest tightened from asthma attacks. Your words at this time were no longer leisurely reflections. They were weapons to protect the intellectual legacy of a lifetime. You understood that if you lost this war, your ideas about freedom and reason would be buried under the dust of conservative dogmas. This event only ended when Stillingfleet died in 1699, but the tension between experimental philosophy and traditional faith remained, like an open wound in the heart of English society. Your lungs, already damaged since childhood, now completely surrendered to the coal-smoke-thickened air of London. During the winter months, you felt as if you were being suffocated by the very city you were governing. You could only endure London during the brief, warm months. Prudence once again reminded you, administrative power cannot be traded for your final breath. In June 1700, you made a difficult decision, resigning from the Board of Trade. You left the peak of political power to return to the silence of the Oates estate in Essex. You left behind the colonial maps and the unfinished debates, understanding that your time was running short. But even in retirement, your intellect refused to rest. You became deeply involved in the recoinage controversy. You saw the national economy swaying due to counterfeit money and devaluation, and you provided sharp advice on interest rates. You believed that the value of currency must be based on the natural laws of the market rather than the subjective will of the ruler. Simultaneously, you began drafting Of the Conduct of the Understanding. This was no longer an abstract theory of perception, but a practical handbook, a final guide for posterity on how to train the intellect to escape the blindness of prejudice. You sat in the library at Oates, looking out over the lush green fields of Essex, feeling the slowing pulse of a life full of upheavals. How could a man too cautious to admit his own words become the voice of liberation across 3 centuries? The answer lies in your very contradictions. You managed a slave-based empire while dreaming of a free world. You debated with bishops to protect reason while still holding on to faith. You understood that man is not a perfect entity, but a creature of experience, full of scars and mistakes. Your ideas at this time had truly escaped. They were no longer in secret drawers or unsigned manuscripts. They were crossing oceans more powerfully than ever. In the plantations of Virginia or the towns of Massachusetts, people were reading your words and beginning to wonder about their own freedom. You had sown the seeds of resistance, even while you were exercising colonial rule. The pages you wrote had become a loaded weapon whose range you yourself could not control. Silence enveloped the final years of the 17th century. You looked back at the journey from the tiny village of Wrington to the halls of power in London, feeling like a traveler who had completed a full cycle of the life of reason. You had witnessed kings fall and empires rise. You had used the scalpel to save lives and the pen to enlighten minds. Now, as the 18th century knocked at the door, you knew you had finished your part. The blueprints for a new world were fully sketched. You closed your eyes, listening to the wind blowing through the trees at Oates. Your lungs were weak, but your thinking had never been so clear. You understood that freedom is not a destination, but a relentless journey of understanding and tolerance. And in the silence of the sunset, you felt content that your blank slate had been filled with the indelible ink of history. In the summer of 1701, you made a final and decisive decision to leave the corridors of power in London completely. You put pen to paper to sign your resignation from the Board of Trade, closing 5 years of dedication to colonial maps and imperial policies. As you stepped out of the office for the last time, you took a deep breath, but your chest responded only with a tightening pain and the familiar wheezing. London, with its thick fog of coal smoke and moisture from the Thames, was no longer the place for you. This city had witnessed your growth, your flight, and your glory, but now it was suffocating the remaining life in the philosopher's lungs. You boarded a carriage back to Oates, a peaceful estate in Essex, far from the clamor of the capital. As the carriage rolled past lush green fields, you felt a spreading relief. You were no longer the powerful official, no longer the invisible architect of William III's court. You were simply John Locke, a 70-year-old man seeking silence to complete the final ink strokes on the blank slate of your life. Oates, the home of Sir Francis Masham and Lady Damaris Cudworth Masham, became the final fortress where you resided to face the darkness of old age and the light of wisdom. At Oates, you found something more precious than fame or power: intellectual empathy. Lady Damaris Masham was not just a kind hostess. She was a talented female philosopher, the daughter of Ralph Cudworth, your former teacher, and most importantly, she was your intellectual soulmate. In the sun-drenched library of the estate, Damaris was the one sitting beside you when you struggled to breathe, the one who read the latest works to you, and the sharp critic for your final reflections. This relationship was a gentle paradox. The man who was cautious all his life, always keeping a distance from the world, found absolute comfort in the intellectual embrace of a woman in his sunset years. You lived at Oates as a family member. You spent time teaching the Masham children, passing on the lessons from some thoughts concerning education you had written years ago. You welcomed old friends, including Isaac Newton. Imagine the two greatest minds of the age sitting by the fireplace, discussing the nature of light, the laws of motion, and even the mysteries of the Bible. Though your body was withering, the fire of reason within you still burned brightly, warmed by sincere friendships and the fresh Essex air. But even in this peace, the habit of tireless work did not let you go. You spent most of your time on a challenging project, a paraphrase and notes on the epistles of St. Paul. This was when the experimental philosopher met the theologian. You applied the very method you had used to study medicine and epistemology to the sacred text, casting aside traditional dogmas, the mist of scholastic interpretations, to find the root meaning Paul intended to convey. You wanted to prove that even the most sublime faith must have a reasonable foundation. You wrote with the caution of one who understood that words about God could also cause wars, and your goal was to seek a harmony between reason and revelation. At the same time, you never stopped revising your masterpiece, an essay concerning human understanding. Each republication was an instance of correction and addition. Like a painter who never sees his painting as perfect, you wrote the additional work of the conduct of the understanding, a kind of manual for rational thinking for posterity. You wanted to teach humans how to manage their own blank slate,
how to avoid prejudice and blindness. Reading furnishes the mind only with materials of knowledge. It is thinking that makes what we read ours. However, there was a secret you still carried to the grave. Until your final days, 2 treatises of government still lay on your desk anonymously. Why did you still refuse to sign it? The political regime was secure. You were a statesman, so what fear still haunted you? Was it the scar from the years of flight, from the deaths of Sydney and Shaftesbury, that had ingrained into your instincts so deeply that you no longer believed in the eternity of any order? Or did you believe that a loaded weapon would have greater power if it did not belong to an individual, but to all of humanity? This final silence of yours was a manifesto that free thought does not need an author. It only needs to be enacted by free people. Entering 1704, your body began a total strike. Your legs were swollen from edema, and your hearing declined to the point where the world around you became unusually quiet. You could no longer walk, having to sit in an armchair or a wheelchair to move within the house. Your hands, originally slender, which had once held the scalpel to save the Earl of Shaftesbury, now trembled so much that they could not hold a pen to write. You accepted this decline with an incredible calm. You were a physician, and you understood the laws of life and death better than anyone. Death is a natural end to a tired machine. You began to prepare for the final journey. You meticulously arranged your will, leaving property to close friends, servants, and especially donating a sum for the education of poor children. You wanted to ensure that the blank slates of future generations would have the opportunity to be written upon with good things, even if you were no longer there to witness it. The prudence and discipline of the country lawyer of old were still present in the way you allocated every book and every coin. In the late days of October 1704, the golden autumn sunlight spilled over the gardens of High Laver. You felt the chill of death creeping into every cell. On October 28, you sat in the armchair in the library. Lady Damaris Masham sat beside you, reading the Psalms to you. Her rhythmic reading was the only sound connecting you to the real world. You closed your eyes, listening to the praises of God and feeling a strange serenity. No more fear of spies, no more torment over slavery, no more fierce debates with bishops. Only the absolute silence of a soul that had fulfilled its mission. On that afternoon, John Locke breathed his last breath as gently as a candle that had just run out of wick. You passed away at the age of 72, leaving behind a world completely changed by your lines of ink. You were buried in the churchyard of High Laver, a simple country church just like your origins. On the tombstone, they carved the Latin inscription you had prepared yourself: "Stop, traveler." Near this place lieth John Locke. If you ask what kind of a man he was, he answers that he lived content with his own small fortune. You did not mention the great works, nor the powerful titles. You chose to be remembered as an ordinary man who lived by reason. But your story did not end at High Laver. Right after you were laid to rest, your cousin Peter King and your friend Pierre Coste announced your final posthumous works. And most importantly, they officially confirmed a secret the world had long only dared to suspect. John Locke was the author of 2 treatises of government. In that moment, you truly escaped your own anonymity. You were no longer the architect in the shadows. You became the lighthouse of modern liberalism. How could a man too cautious to admit his own words become the voice of liberation across 3 centuries? The answer lies in the fact that you did not write for yourself, you wrote for the future. Your ideas have crossed oceans, becoming the soul of the United States Declaration of Independence the foundation for the constitutions of democratic nations. Your words, once freed from your name, have become the common property of humanity. Your life was a series of paradoxes. You craved freedom but were surrounded by fear. You worshipped reason but had to face the tragic contradictions of reality. But it was those very contradictions that made your greatness. You were not a saint. You were a man of flesh and blood, a blank slate that had recorded for itself the most precious lessons of a turbulent era. You have taught us that knowledge is an experimental journey, and freedom is a contract that needs to be protected with eternal vigilance. Tonight, as the audience of Mind Manor slowly drifts into sleep, your silhouette, the slender man sitting by candlelight at Oates, remains there as a gentle reminder that in a world full of dogmas and fanaticism, reason remains the only candle we can light. You have closed your eyes, but the eyes of reason you opened for humanity will never close. Rest in peace, John Locke. Your blank slate is now filled with the aura of enlightenment, and your words will echo forever as long as humans crave to live in freedom and tolerance. The clamor of the London political scene recedes, leaving only your heartbeat, slow and steady. The images of the ancient Oxford lecture halls, Shaftesbury's silver tube, the anonymous manuscripts in the dark, all have flowed into a current, and in that current remains a gentle message. Reason is the only candle of man. It may be quiet, it may be silent, but it is always there, like a moonlight that never goes out, illuminating freedom and tolerance. You take a deep breath and then exhale slowly. The silhouette of John Locke by the armchair at the Oates estate fades, giving way to the gentle void of sleep, like the reading of Psalms by Lady Damaris fading behind the door, like the candlelight on the writing desk slowly dimming, so that you hear only the wind through the Essex fields and your own breath. Everything settles, gently, slowly. You let your eyes close gradually, so the story turns into a gentle dream, taking you into a deep, peaceful night.